Hello, everyone, and a big welcome to our members and guests. My name is Maria Jolanides, and I'm this year's president of the DIA. The two key mandates of the Digital Imaging Association are to provide education and networking opportunities for our members. I hope you find the educational aspect worthwhile, and we invite your feedback. Our membership is comprised of pre-press, printers, packaging converters, designers, advertisers, print buyers, equipment, and consumable manufacturers and vendors. If you are with us as a guest, please consider joining the Digital Imaging Association. Today's session is an example of the high caliber meetings we run. If you would like more information on membership, please contact either myself or Mark McLeod at 416-254-4941 or Mark at digitalimagingassociation.com or click on the QR code provided. Like most trade associations today, financial stability does not come from the membership revenues alone. And so we turn to the vendor suppliers to support our goals. We're honored to continue to receive the support recognition of the DIA's contribution to the growth and development of the graphic arts industry from the following companies. Our platinum sponsors, Asia Pulp and Paper, Canon, Durst, HP, Konica Minolta, Spicers, and Trinet Global Logistics. Our global sponsors, Adobe, Fujifilm, Graphics Canada, Heidelberg, Innovative Display, Kodak, Kongsberg Precision Cutting Systems, Mini Giants, and Plastic and Paper, our newest gold sponsor. Thank you. And our silver sponsor, Sydney Stone. A huge thank you to all our sponsors. Please consider these companies and their demonstrated support of the industry when making your purchasing decisions. Technology for this webinar has been generously provided by HP. At this time, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, my good friend, Dan Thompson, CEO and founder of Italic Press. Dan is excited to keep pushing the definition of what print is through innovation and automation. Italic crafts high-value visual communication projects that are inspirational, removing barriers for creators so they can make unique, stunning, and meaningful brand experiences. Dan and his team use the best technology and their expertise to elevate brand value for the most talented creative minds in Canada and the world, as at their two plants located in Toronto, Ontario, and St. John, New Brunswick. Dan, I'll pass it over to you to introduce today's topic and our panel of experts.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you for everyone in the room, and thank you for joining us online. Today's seminar is titled, The Right Way to Be Sustainable. In an industry where owners are stretched to rationalize anyone on staff who is not directly accountable for manufacturing revenue, the pressures from governments and clients to be more environmentally sustainable are becoming overwhelming in tough economic times. We all want to do what's right, but the focus has become fragmented. Our outstanding panel is going to help us through the challenges of becoming sustainable as a printing company. I'd like to introduce our panelists. Our first is Holly Denson-Camp. Holly graduated from University of British Columbia with a bachelor's in environment and sustainability, and has been applying her specialization to the world of printing. Driven by implementing cutting-edge sustainable business strategies and lowering overall manufacturing-related carbon emissions, she takes pride in leading internal environmental initiatives at Mitchell Press. Through her productive tenure at Mitchell, Holly is credited for implementing accurate and thorough emission tracking procedures, revamping the internal recycling system, adding new recycling streams, and championing Mitchell's Green Team, dedicated to sustainable progress. A principal tenet of Holly's environmental stance is a committed rejection of greenwashing and the importance of providing honest reporting to establish a trust-based partnership between Mitchell and their clients. Our second panelist is Jeffrey Crawford, Vice President of Sustainability at Sustana. Jeff leads ESG across the group's brands. I think that is environmental social governance, including Sustana's fiber and roll-in paper Sistana is a leading manufacturer of sustainability produced premium recycled paper and fiber, using recycled material to create high quality, low carbon products for food packaging, specialty paper, and printing papers. Jeff brings with him 15 years of experience in corporate sustainability, climate change, and international sustainable development. Prior to joining Sistana, he held leadership and management roles in sustainability consulting firms where he supported the wide range of corporate and financial service sector clients with their climate and ESG strategies, risk integration and management, and disclosure in accordance with major frameworks and strategy. From 2007 to 2014, Jeff worked for multiple United Nations agencies, governments technically backstopping UN negotiations and supporting national level policy development on the SDGs, climate, and disaster risk reduction. In his personal time, he enjoys rock and ice climbing, hiking with his Siberian Husky Azuri. Oh, that's great. Tova Davison, Executive Director, Strategy and Governance from Sustainable Waterloo. Tova leads Sustainable Waterloo under the Board of Directors and is responsible for developing strategic direction, supporting team members, and building key relationships throughout the Waterloo region. She brings her experience in public relations and communications to creatively approach sustainability opportunities. Paired with her business background, Tova is uniquely qualified to collaborate with organizations in the Waterloo region to help drive change locally and provincially. A former recipient of the City of Guelph's Mayor's Award of Excellence and member of the Guelph Mercury's Top 40 Under 40, Tova always leads by example while inspiring others to do the same. Welcome. So we're going to ask questions, and we're going to start by really relating it to what does it mean to be environmentally sustainable. So I'll put it out to you, Jeff, perhaps to start. Can you define sustainability, and then we'll narrow it down to sustainability in a printing company?
Maria, Dan, thank you so much for those kind words, and thank you all for having me here today. It's a pleasure to speak with you all. So as many of you know, defining sustainable development, corporate sustainability, and/or ESG has been a really contentious issue, and there's so many different takes on it. I'd like just to spend a little bit of time on the background, and then we can get into kind of what it really means for printing companies here. So if we look back, sustainability really originated around sustainable development for the world as far back as 1987, and we defined it there as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. More recently, in 2016, all of the governments in the world came together and united around what does that concretely mean, and how can we measure that? So they moved forward with the global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of those, and those revolve around everything from achieving zero hunger, ensuring decent work, climate action, driving responsible consumption and production here, and a number of other goals and targets. But these were set around where do we want to advance as a community here, as a nation, as many different citizens. And what we want to do is translate that into corporate sustainability. So the evolution of corporate sustainability has really started out with corporate philanthropy, where a lot of actions, tried to drive some social environmental impact, but weren't necessarily related to a company's own long-term value creation or within their value chain. That evolved into more so corporate social responsibility, corporate sustainability, and ESG. And what has been driving it more recently has been the recognition that a lot of these environmental, social, economic governance issues are actually financially material to these companies. So it's not just doing something good for the community side of it. These are real business risks. And there's been an increase from the investor community and the regulatory community to drive corporate disclosures around how they're managing these risks how they're leveraging opportunities, as we try to transition to more of a low carbon economy or to a circular economy, and try to put regulation around, protecting biodiversity and nature, and, driving diversity, equity, inclusion within our communities here. How does this relate to a printing company now? Or how does this relate to any company really? Well, it revolves around understanding what are the most important issues to your own company. And so when I engage with many different companies here, including printing companies or paper companies, what we start out with is doing a materiality assessment. So we work with our stakeholders, we engage our investors, our employees, our customers, local governments, local NGOs, and what do you think are the most important issues to us? And then based on those issues, we try to find KPIs that are aligned from the different standards, be those the Global Reporting Initiative, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board here. We set those KPIs, and then we measure the impact and we measure that risk. And then, Dan, to your point on the fragmentation is everywhere. We can't do everything. We have limited resources here. We try to dedicate resources to dealing and working with those most material issues, and then we build upon those. And those will evolve year over year.
Hey, and thank you, Jeff. And Tova, I mean, you're involved in the Waterloo area and advising people to how to do this. What are you finding that companies in the printing industry require? Oh, and I think your microphone's off.
Okay, I'm using my phone.
Perfect.
Muted again.
And you're muted again. Oh, I'm sorry, Tova.
Okay, both have to be open. Okay, thank you so much. It's an interesting conversation about this business and sustainability and that evolution. And Jeffrey, that was a great introduction to where the background comes from and how this works. Sustainable Waterloo Region works with a variety of organizations, actually, and bigger than Waterloo Region, we're Wellington, Perth, Oxford County, so a big sort of area within southwestern Ontario. And what we know is that an organization can actually only be truly sustainable if it works within a framework of there being a financial return on investment. So those KPIs that Jeffrey was just talking about are really critical to the long-term sustainability of sustainability within an organization. And what we're finding is that we need to find the places where the business has a pain point that sustainability can be the solution to the problem for them. And oftentimes what we're seeing is it can be a number of different things. It could be saving on your operating costs. That's a big one. If you're using less energy, you're reducing your operating costs. It's as simple as that. It could be attraction and retention of employees. In our area of the world right now, it's really difficult to attract and hire people, and people want to work in places that our values aligned with them. That's important. Differentiation from their companies, their competitors within their sector is a huge driver as well. And so that measurable anti-greenwash, this is what we're doing, this is the numbers. Loved hearing that, Holly, in your introduction. Like, I want to see the numbers, and only by putting out the numbers can you actually truly have a UVP to your competitors. It can also look at things like risk management and risk mitigation, like Jeffrey talked about, both reputational risk, exposed actual risk for climate change, but also regulatory risk coming down. And finally, you know, it's an interesting one because if you want to be a truly sustainable company, status quo isn't possible. So what that means is you actually drive innovation in all areas of your business. Sustainable businesses are more often more innovative than everyone else because you can't just do it the way you've always done it, because the way you've always done it hasn't been sustainable. So it's a good variety.
Now, Tova, with my experience and talking with your panelists, all of you yesterday, there's a lot of acronyms involved in this industry. And, you know, there are people on this call that may not even be familiar with this topic. And you mentioned KPI. Can you define that for our audience today?
Oh, yeah. A KPI is just any key performance indicator in any business. So any business, I actually used to work in marketing. I was vice president of a marketing agency before I came to this role. So like, I'm in the world you're in. I totally know this world. And it is whatever key performance indicator. It could be the amount of printing that you output. It could be the number of square feet. It could be your profitability. It could be all kinds of different things. It could be your retention of employees. Whatever are the key performance indicators your organization is already tracking. Often the conversation with our member organization starts with, tell me your pain points. What are the things that are happening in your business? Forget sustainability. What's the problems that you're facing right now? What's keeping you up at night? Now, are there ways that we can use sustainability to help solve those problems? So it's not a thing that we do over here. It's actually deeply embedded in everything that you're doing.
Actually, thank you for that. Polly, so you are working in a printing company and not as in an external role, but embedded in a printing company doing an environmental role. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think I can approach this question a little bit more granularly with examples from the printing company that I'm working with Mitchell. So I kind of wanted to echo a bit of what Jeff was saying, that sustainability is obviously extremely hard to define and outline. Like, that's not something that anyone can really come to an exact definition. But I think in my mind, for a printing company or really any business, it comes down to honest intentions and honest reporting. It can be really daunting to kind of begin that journey in sustainability and to improve your company's sustainability metrics. But I think the best thing to start with is to do some self-reflecting and being really transparent about where you're starting. So I kind of like to begin with that honest reporting, honest accounting. You need to really know where you're starting, even if it doesn't sound that nice to begin with. You want to know like where your emissions are coming from, where your waste is coming from, your material usage, things like that, and just really having a good understanding of your baseline. And then from that, I think it's possible to then develop those robust mitigation and reduction plans and making sure that those come alongside with timelines. You want to clearly line out what your goals are and how you're planning to get there and what that time frame is specifically. And then I'd say along the sorry, did you want to say something?
I was just gonna say, you know, as a owner of a printing company, I mean, sometimes initiatives, the hardest thing to do is to start. And how would you recommend starting? I mean, obviously, most printing companies that I know don't have systems in place that are either legislated or, you know, feel good. But like, where does this start?
I think honestly, a really big thing that you can do is to assign like an environmental champion in your company. And so obviously I recommend that because that's kind of what my role is. But it makes a big difference when you have someone that's accountable for these kind of activities and these initiatives, and someone that can push it forward and isn't maybe bogged down by their other role or their more prominent role. So that's something I think is really important. It might start out as a part-time position. It might start out as, you know, like a percentage of someone's position, but I think having someone dedicated to that is where you can really start to get the ball rolling.
Great. Anything else to add?
I want to actually, sorry. One last thing, I think it's really important to always be reevaluating your sustainability goals, and you never want to treat sustainability as a one-off activity in your company. It's something that's constantly evolving, something you'll want to probably continuously allocate more resources towards as you go and as you grow more in that area. You never want to consider yourself done. You know, there's always room for improvement, no matter what stage you're at.
Hey, yeah, I mean, to me, that sounds a lot like the automation journey that everyone's sort of been going down the last few years in printing companies, for sure. I mean, you know, we start to do something, we get bigger at doing it, but in the case of automation, there are real financial outcomes and productivity enhancements that go along with that. How does a printer be socially sustainable while being fiscally responsible? What are the rewards for this?
Oh, I'm so excited by this question. Can I jump in a little bit?
Absolutely.
You know, the real magic of sustainability, you talked about automation. Automation is efficiency. Sustainability is efficiency. We have to stop thinking about this as a corporate social responsibility nice to do. And I'm going to give an example everyone will understand. GM is a manufacturer. Printers are a type of manufacturing, right? We're making printed materials. GM decided like 10 years ago that it was requiring all of its plants in Canada to be waste-free. And it took the people who used to do waste management and gave them a new frame of mind, because they could not send any of that scrap to any kind of recycling or compost. Those were all off the table. What they started to do, though, was to see it as a resource, and they started to sell it. And they saved 15% of their carbon footprint, but had a $5 million revenue stream from it. This is not about sustainability versus profitability. It's profitability through sustainability. That's what happens, and that's the work that we do all the time with member organizations. We've talked with steel fabricators and printers, and we work with all kinds of companies. And it's not something you do because it's the right thing to do. You do it because it's good for your business. And it can be very, very profitable.
Okay, great. Well, Jeff, how do we like back away from that, and what are in the larger scope of things? How are large corporations approaching this? I guess GM is a good example, and then how are small companies approaching this too?
Great question. And I love your quote that you just gave there, Tova. Profitability through sustainability. I'm gonna have to remember that one. So, the larger corporations have been dealing with this, for the last 10 years. And, what we're seeing here with a lot of the new regulation coming out and requirements on suppliers, a lot of them are getting nervous because they're being asked to report on so many things and drive maturity and sustainability very quickly, where what we've seen is that maturity has taken larger companies, anywhere from 5 years to develop here. So that's a lot of the pressure. And if you've ever led change initiatives, outside of the sustainability space, they're very difficult. Behavioral change is difficult. But how we're seeing this addressed in larger companies is, it starts internally. And then when they realize that a lot of the opportunity for impact, or where a lot of the risk lies, is actually in their value chain, not just in the boundaries of their operations, then they start trying to see how can they work with their suppliers, how can they work with their consumers, how can they work with the recovery of their products, so that there's a lower amount of impact there. And that's where we're seeing it a lot. So I want to step back a little bit and touch on Holly's point here, where she's talking about how can companies get started, and they start with, hiring maybe a part-time person and then a full-time person. What I want to stress is that the sustainability teams of the individuals that you hire, they're definitely required, and increasingly so. But to Tova's point here about how do we actually drive change, how do we collect this information, that needs to be integrated within your typical business unit. So integrating those risks into your enterprise risk management frameworks here, integrating that energy efficiency or renewable energy supply targets, those need to be integrated within your operations or your energy departments there. So working on that integration, and then how is that being impacted to smaller companies here is they're being required to report externally on their own risk and their own, say, for example, scope 3 emissions, which are emissions from the value chain. So purchased goods and services. So if we're selling printing paper to these companies, then they want to know what our emissions are, right? But they also want to know what our climate risk is. They want to know what our water risk is here. And so now they're sending out questionnaires, see through EcoVadis or through Sphera, or they're asking companies to report to CDP. It actually isn't an acronym anymore. That's their name, CDP, but it was formerly Carbon Disclosure Project. So there's a lot of pressure for companies to fill out these really complicated questionnaires. We're asked to fill out for EcoVadis. It's there's potentially 315 options across the board here. And it's daunting when you start that. So where can small companies start, right? So that's with, first of all, making a commitment to what are your principles? What do you care about here? That may be committing to the UN Global Compact principles. We've done that with our company. Then it's building that into governance framework. So do you have a board, or do you have an ESG committee at the board level? Do you have a senior management ESG or sustainability committee? And then it's about, once you've done that materiality assessment, you've got those KPIs in place. It's where is the information going to come from in the organization to disclose that? And do we have the systems in place? So, we've adopted Sphera as one of our ESG data management softwares, and that's helping to bring together that. But that has to pull data from our ERP system here, from our procurement system. So it's how do we link those together, right? I did an article with Triple Pundit, ESG for SMEs, how small and medium-sized businesses can embrace ESG for long-term growth. If you're interested in that, I'll share that in the chat. But yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Can I just jump into one other note is that, you know, if you don't have executive sponsorship, if this isn't something that the leadership of an organization doesn't believe in, and you've got someone who's passionate, they will do sort of, I think of it as ticky-tacky stuff. Like they'll do this little thing over here and this little thing over here, but this embedding that Jeffrey is talking about can't happen. It can't become the responsibility of the finance team when they record the bills to actually record the amount of energy that you've used at the same time on this platform. Like those are the kinds of integrations. And I would just say, you know, Holly's been talking about this, figuring out your baseline and having this measurement. And Jeffrey, you talked about where your materiality is. The thing is that business, and you all know this, business measures what matters to them, and then they manage what they measure. And if they don't measure and they have a claim of sustainability, I count it as greenwash. If you don't have the numbers as a business, if you're not doing measurement, you're not actually doing it.
So anyone making a claim that can't back it up with data, that's a definition of greenwashing for you, Tova. Is that true?
Oh, well, there's a whole lot more, but that would fit in there.
Okay.
That would fit in there. And the thing is, it's because really, if businesses care about something, you care about your finances. So do you measure it? Do you get a report? Do you take it to your board of directors? Do you make decisions based on it? Same thing in sustainability, in employee turnover, in your a promoter score, your net promoter score from your customers. If you care about those things, you're measuring them and they're impacting your decisions.
Now, Holly, you were talking about greenwashing in your opening statement or your introduction. How do you define what's right and what is greenwashing?
Yeah, I mean, I find greenwashing to usually manifest itself in, you know, marketing campaigns and communications and things like that. You know, I think it's often strategically wording things and embellishing certain statements. Maybe, for example, using the word renewable, but not really defining what you mean by renewable. Is the resource that you're talking about renewable in 10 years or 500 years? Is that something that's, you know, a time frame that's relevant to your business needs? So there's ways to like manipulate your words to make it sound a little bit more sustainable. Or even using the word recyclable to describe a material that, yes, can technically be recycled, but it isn't functionally recycled in any kind of local system. So it's things like that. I think more often than not, it's leaving out key information that might make, you know, your company look a little bit less sustainable and focusing on the key few things that you think make you look a bit better. So I think going back to what Tova was saying about being able to back up your statements, I think if you can't prove what you're saying to a skeptic, then you probably aren't really doing what you say that you're doing.
So, I mean, I work on the front end of the business and talking to customers, and we should really have, you know, environmental statements that we can back up. Then all organizations should have this information at their disposal. Great. Okay. So I feel like this sort of leads into the conversation from greenwashing into, you know, carbon neutral. What are the purpose of carbon neutral credits, and should you be buying them? Is that a way to make you not be greenwashing? What are our thoughts on carbon credits?
Yeah. That's a very hotly debated topic right now. So without getting myself in too much trouble here, I'll express some personal views that don't necessarily represent those of my organization here. So developing countries, global South countries here, you know, don't have the same resources to drive climate mitigation, and they're also generally, in many cases, more vulnerable than we are and less responsible because they haven't historically been producing those. So I think there's a moral obligation for, you know, companies who have been responsible for greenhouse gas emissions to help support mitigation adaptation measures. So the purchasing of carbon credits, high quality carbon credits that can be monitored and where there is transparency, I think is still an important thing to do. Now, that said, when we talk about greenwashing, we specifically around carbon credits or claims to carbon neutrality, it's really important to be very clear about that. So we have three kind of types of categories of emissions that we talk about here. So we have scope 1, those are our operational emissions here. You have scope 2, which is essentially purchased electricity from the grid or purchased steam. And then you have scope 3 emissions, which are value chain. Those coming both from upstream, your purchased goods and services, also to downstream. So you have processing of sold goods. So when we produce fiber, we sell it to a printer or we sell it to a packaging converter, where those emissions are, and then how are those emissions recovered. So we just for the first time calculated our scope 3 emissions in great detail with actual raw data, primary data coming in. And the majority of our emissions actually sits within our processing of sold goods, which we have very little control over. So actually we sell our product and how companies use it, how printing companies use it. And so, you know, if you're going to be selling a product to a consumer or to another business and you say it's carbon neutral, if you're using carbon credits for that, is it just counting scope 1 emissions and scope 2, or is it also including scope 3? It really needs to be there. What's more important, I want to say what's more important here is there's one leading framework for setting targets for climate mitigation, which is called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So major brands are now asking suppliers and requesting that they set a science-based target. And to set a science-based target, if your scope 3 emissions are material, which for most all of our companies, they're the majority of emissions, you have to include them in that target. And you have to then report on progress annually against that target. And carbon credits do not count towards that. Additionally, carbon credits cannot be used in doing an LCA according to ISO standards here. And so if you really want to make change, the only kind of credits that would be useful here are renewable energy credits here. And I would go for Greene's, Greene's certified renewable energy credits. And the only carbon credits that would be accepted in the science-based targets, once you've gotten to net zero, you're at the very end there. And then only carbon credits that are for removals, not actually just for mitigation technologies. I'll stop there because I know my panelists also want to jump in.
Yeah, there's a lot of framework around that. What caught my interest though was that there are different types of carbon credits, high quality versus low quality. What is a low quality carbon credit? Tova.
Sure. So low quality, I mean, there's all kinds of assessments of ways to look at your carbon credits and your offsets. So this is all about net zero. A lot of people don't even know what net zero is. So I'm just going to step back with
Sure.
What do you mean? If a company says, what does net zero mean? On the very basic level, what net zero means is if your company emits 100 tons of greenhouse gases, you have done something to deal with those 100 tons in a very unscientific way. But the ideal is not, I'm a 100-ton emitter, so I'm going to buy 100 tons worth of offsets. You're still emitting that. That's not sustainability. To me, that's actually the height of greenwash. But because you're actually using the system to not do your due diligence, the trick is to actually do all of the efficiency work, to do all of your process change, to change your building, to change your scope 3 instead of being, as Jeffrey talked about, just being like an extraction economy. How do you become a more circular economy player? How do you create a value chain versus a supply chain? All of those kinds of things, which makes it kind of complicated. As a printer, you're asking everyone you buy from and everyone you sell to all do the same kind of monitoring, measuring, and tracking. It's a big undertaking to do. When you're looking for a carbon credit, a good offset, what you're looking to find is something that brings people that you can go and you can quantify. Is it actually doing anything to either feed in the energy grid, so you're creating a cleaner grid? Are you doing any carbon capture, which there is some question marks around? Trees are the best carbon capture technology we have, but it takes a really long time for them to pull very much out. So reforestation is great, but there are actually frameworks that will go through and verify carbon credits so that you're not just paying into them. Because some places a carbon credit is $15. Pretty sure that that's not going to be a very reputable one.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, we see companies and marketing organizations offsetting the impact of their projects with carbon credits. And as printers, I think we need to know what are the best type of carbon credits to apply and guide our clients towards. But that said, Holly, in your company, in a printing company, what are our carbon outputs basically? How like we use resources, paper, ink, electricity. Are there any other ones that we might be surprised to find out about?
Yeah, I mean, the big ones definitely are the paper, the manufacturing of paper, which does fall under those scope 3 indirect emissions. That I would say, if you were to, look at it on a pie chart, like 95% of a printer's emissions. But there are things like if your printing press has an afterburner, that's something that emits methane. There are, our heat is gas heating for the most part. The printers often require natural gas to be hot. So like, it's oftentimes you're kind of limited with the technology that maybe you've grandfathered in, and it's not necessarily the easiest thing to adapt those technology to be more environmentally friendly, or even have the option for it to be, electricity based. So that's something that we dealt with when considering carbon credits. I think alongside what Jeff and Tova were saying, it's definitely something you have to grapple with. It feels like cheating, honestly, and it's not something that I think anyone should consider as their first option. I think it's, reduce first, and you can offset as you go, as maybe in a transitionary way while you're making your way towards a more natural neutrality. And I think we just have to be realistic with, the industry that we're in and how much some of those things can change, and where we might need to rely on offsets for the time being, at least, rather than not doing anything about those emissions.
So we really should be thinking about reduce first, and then when there's no alternative, that's where we apply offsets, high quality offsets.
It's interesting. I have had member organizations that we work with use offsets as a financial mechanism to drive change to happen faster. So they say, okay, we're going to offset everything starting tomorrow. Our entire carbon footprint, we've done all the work to measure what our footprint is. We're going to offset all of it. And it's going to cost us this much money. And every time we do something to be more efficient, we're going to save ourselves money every year, so we don't have to offset it. So there are ways you can look at it that can actually drive the business case, make it a stronger business case. Love these resources that Jeffrey's been putting in the chat for the greenhouse gas protocol, same protocol that we follow. There are international standards here. This is exactly the kind of stuff we do to go look at those so that people can understand what to do.
Yeah,
and
great. Oh, sorry, if I can, just great point, Tova. Declare, you'll be asked about this in a CDP questionnaire. It's about putting an internal price on carbon. You can also put an internal price on water if you're a water intensive industry, and it's a shadow price. And that's a great way to drive investment. So the Canadian federal government has set a carbon price there. That price will increase. It's aligned with the International Energy Agency's net zero scenario. So how are we going to get to net zero, as a country or on the global level here? How much do we need to mitigate? So that carbon price increases. So you can set your own internal shadow carbon price in relationship to how that price will increase in that scenario. So that can be before it was 50, getting up to 80 to $150 per carbon ton. And going back to our metrics, if you're thinking about those KPIs, just for your business metric, we use, short tons of paper produced per GHG emission. So you can take that carbon price and you can apply it to that. If you want to look at your energy cost as relates to your production, your intensity measure could be, metric tons of fiber, metric tons of paper printed, divided by your energy amount there. And then you can look at the cost of energy going up, and you can look at investments in energy efficiency or renewable energy supply, which could lock you into certain prices. We use a lot of those measures there. And then you move into the GHG emissions. So metric tons produced divided by metric tons of CO2 equivalent that are there. So these are those metrics that you can use to drive that change.
Well, and that sounds like a terrible amount of work for most small companies, I would think. But but it's necessary because it's going to cost us money in the future, you're saying, basically. And I think, as a small business owner myself, can you expand on how we can start to measure our footprint? And are there reasons? And I know it's different all across Canada too. So How do we start to measure our
Yeah.
carbon footprint?
You know, it's interesting because it's actually there. You can find just Excel spreadsheets. There are softwares you can buy, all that kind of stuff. But there are Excel spreadsheets you can use. You just need to know the emission factors. That's the amount of carbon that is released for that type of energy in your region. So in Ontario, for example, the carbon emission factor of electricity is about 1/10 of what it is for fossil fuels, natural gas, gasoline, propane, fuel oil, that kind of stuff. You just need to know that emission factor number. There are some great tools. There's a new startup that we work with sometimes called Carbon Hound, and it focuses on SMEs. If people want to go look at them, they'd be a cool tool to talk to. But you know, a lot of this stuff, I'm sure that the people in the room, I'm trying to see the faces of the people in the room as we're talking. I'm sure some of you are like, oh my God, this is so much. Am I right? Are you all freaking out?
I am.
Okay. Okay. So if I can make this simple, and it's going to be simple and imperfect, but I'm a firm believer that perfection is the enemy of progress, and you do the best you can until you know better, and then you do better. So as long as we're all moving, we all got to move in that direction. So if you're really like, what is all this? If you can measure the amount of electricity you're using and the amount of fossil fuels you're using, natural gas and gasoline in things that are owned by your organization, that's the scope 1 and 2 that Jeffrey talked about. Those alone are a quick first step. This is you're putting your toe in the water. And then you know where is your footprint coming from because you're now measuring it because energy equals carbon. Some people don't understand that your energy use is usually where your carbon comes from. That can be heating energy, it can be electricity energy, transportation energy. Energy equals carbon. Then you start to see where do you have control and where are the places that you can get a few quick wins. Quick wins are so important because then you're like, okay, wait, we're on the path. Think of it as the gateway in, like, oh, there's a couple little things. And so I want to tell just one story of an organization. It's a steel fabricator, but it's relative. It's relatable to this industry. They were having a terrible time with their loading bay doors. You all have, as printers, you all have loading bay doors, right?
You do.
Those doors. And they're open, and all of the heating and cooling is flying out the door, right? Drive you crazy, doesn't it? Yeah, forget sustainability. It's going to drive you crazy. It's going to cost you a fortune. You're like, shut the door. So this steel fabricator that we worked with, he tried everything. This is a small family business. It's not a big company. They're like 30 employees. He tried to say to them, oh, it's going to be, you know, really expensive. Can you shut the doors? That didn't work. They didn't shut the doors. He talked about, you know, it causes a lot of carbon emissions because they're a sustainability culture. Didn't shut the doors. They tried to do all these things, could not convince them. They even showed them all the data. It didn't work. They had people coming in saying you should do air curtains. And he's like, oh, I can't make the financial business case for air curtains. They're really expensive. What he did was he had an electrician come in and he put a kill switch on the door. So the HVAC turns off if the door is open. So the people running the doors get hot or cold. So then they shut the door. It cost them $1,100. That's the stuff we're talking about. This doesn't have to be solar panels and that kind of stuff. It's more often windows and insulation and efficient processes. It's far more often that stuff than all of these fancy things. We get to that, but we start with these like, wait a minute, how can we be more efficient? How can we reduce our energy use? And reducing your energy is reducing money.
Wow. Well, that sounds like tangible that I could take care of. But is my only choice? So my only choice is not just to hire a consultant. Then we don't need consultancy firms to understand where our energy is going, but that helps to quantify on the data side when we move forward and start to formalize this. Correct?
I would say yes. I mean, a consultant coming in, what they would be able to do, and there are some incredible both sort of consultants for your physical building and consultants for your processes. And sometimes organizational do both, and sometimes it's two different. They will help you create really good plans and be able to map out what the impact of that will be, both your financial impact, your efficiency impact, and your environmental impact. And so they can help with all of that planning. If you start down the path of having a little bit of information saved, you'll start to see that there are places where, you know, your heating costs go way up because of this. If you have there are data sensors and loggers on all of your places, like if you've got compressors and your printers and all that kind of stuff, and you're like, why is this printer with its data showing me that it's using more energy at night? Well, clearly you got a maintenance problem. Call the maintenance guys. That's going to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. It's that kind of granularity of looking at your operations and configuring your operations to be as efficient as possible is what's going to drive you towards sustainability.
Sure, and probably help you through the rebate systems and the programs that are available on a local, federal sort of scale.
Well, and often you need to talk to, your local utilities to get the pre-work done before you can even apply. So talking to people, sharing that you want to be on this journey. I mean, we're a nonprofit that helps organizations do this. We work with about 140 organizations in this area. So there are lots of organizations that can help you, whether they're for-profit consultants or not, nonprofits that can help with some of this, or you hire someone amazing like Holly who can be like, I can actually handhold you through this whole thing. We've even seen some organizations have a shared resource that they hire. Each of them hire them for a quarter of their time, and 4 companies get one sustainability person together. So that would be a really cool way for an organization like this to be able to say, there's 4 printers in the GTA. We each are going to pay for a quarter of that person's time, and then they can do collaborative projects, and you get bulk buying. Like, there's all these great business ways of doing it.
Well, it sounds like really when you start down a road, more forks in the road appear, and you just sort of do it organically. Or is there a methodology to this though? Like, that's where a consultant would really help, I believe.
Yeah, I've worked in a lot of consulting firms here myself. There's a whole wide range, as Tova mentioned here, where you can pay an enormous amount of money. And then there are more boutique firms that, specialize on supporting SMEs here, and the cost will be much lower. Again, if you're committed to making the journey, I like to start with having a consulting firm to help you with the materiality assessment to understand what your issues are there, and it helps you focus incredibly there. And then what we're seeing is that GHG emissions, climate is a really material issue for this and many other industries, and doing calculations can be tough. I really liked how Tova simplified where you can start out. There are free calculators that you can use here, but basically you need to identify where the sources of those emissions are in your organization, and then start collecting that data. And that data will often come from, if you don't have sub-metering, it's coming from your invoices, your electricity invoices, your natural gas invoices, and just aggregating those on an annual basis here. And that's what a lot of those free calculators are going to do. But you can also have a consulting or nonprofit come in and try to set up that framework, or a tool that you can use internally, which is more automated. And then it's about setting up the processes to collect that on an annual basis there. So I think they are helpful for that, but it's dedicating some budget to that to get started, and then understanding where you want to go and how much this is worth. And then you can look to different consultancies for different types of work. Some will be more specific to being able to help you with the regulatory environment. Others can be on reporting. You may be asked to do a CDP report, or you may be asked to report to EcoVadis or others. And so they can help guide you through those types of reporting exercises.
Great. And Holly, can you tell us how, you got to where you are right now at Mitchell Press? Like, how did Mitchell start all this? And tell us your story.
Yeah, a big part of the creation of my role was honestly to kind of get that reporting back in track. So we actually utilized Climate Smart for our reporting, so that they helped us with those emissions factors. They have a software that you can input data into that kind of spits out some of the information that's a bit harder to get. So I could input my paper usage, and it could spit out the emissions associated with that and things like that. So there's still data collecting on our end, which was what I was most responsible for, and putting those systems together and finding out where all of those emissions data are coming from within the company. And like Tova was saying, it's coming from invoices half the time, and that's a lot of data entry. But once you realize that that's where it's coming from, you can start to put new things in place. Maybe people are tracking it a bit more consolidated, and you're able to gather that at, at an annual basis rather than searching through files to get invoices. And so that's where I kind of started out, was definitely getting the reporting back on track. And so now we're back up to date, and we're able to use those reports and reduction plans and mitigation plans, which is sort of the stage that we're at now. Kind of coming up with those short-term goals and long-term goals, and where that falls our organization has been kind of our next big step.
Okay. And I guess, with the data or starting to accumulate data, that sets a company up to effectively interface with various government levels to, participate in different various programs in the industry. Are there programs for the printing industry in general?
That is a good question. I think something that I've relied on a lot is kind of getting a community together or getting involved in a community that exists. So, for example, we're part of the Burnaby Board of Trade. And so that's kind of a municipal group that, they put out useful webinars and different educational campaigns and things like that can kind of teach you things about those government programs, and they can bring people together to share those ideas. I found that to be really useful to kind of understand what's going on in your local area, because it is so locally dependent. It's going to be completely different wherever you are. So kind of getting involved in that community is super useful, and I highly recommend that. You're going to be exposed to a lot more programs that you maybe didn't even know existed.
Right. Okay, that totally makes sense. And it is very different across Canada. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, and there is, Sustainable Waterloo Region actually started another nonprofit called Green Economy Canada. And what Green Economy Canada does is takes the framework of our core program, which is called the Impact Network, and helps other nonprofits create programs like that. So there could be supports with other locations that Green Economy Canada is helping, and they are actually looking at offering support to organizations directly. So there certainly are groups around that you can connect to, and getting involved in the community, as Holly was talking about, is a really important piece in learning from each other. It's a big part of the work that we do. There are incentives, and there are retrofit incentives, especially deep energy retrofit incentives that are available, but you have to be a fairly big organization to work directly. It's through the CIB, the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, but you have to actually be doing a retrofit to the tune of $25 million to qualify to talk to them directly. So there are aggregators of projects. Efficiency Canada is an aggregator of projects, and they can help you go through the process of getting access to these loans. Now, it is loans, but the deeper the retrofit, the lower the interest rate. So if you're only reducing your carbon footprint by 30%, say your interest rate, I don't know what the numbers are because it changes all the time, but pretend your interest rate would be 10% if you were going to 30% reduced in greenhouse gases. If you are reducing down to 80%, it might only be 2 or 3% interest rate. So it becomes more affordable as you come down. And so there can be support for that kind of stuff, and that can be something that could be looked at. I know that Van City as well does some really interesting stuff. There's some great organizations that invest in energy retrofits. You can also look at, if you're wanting to have some of these things done, there are also something called ESCOs. You have to be careful, make sure you find a good ESCO, but an ESCO is a renewable energy company that will actually install things like solar panels on your behalf. They still own the solar panels, you buy the energy from them. It cleans up your own energy use, all of those kinds of things. There's a really good one here called VCT Group that does solar installations and will just rent your roof so you can make it a solar installation that earns you a little bit of money. People are renting your roof. They've got solar carports, which go over top of your parking lot. So your staff all of a sudden get covered parking, and it's covered with solar panels. There's outside of the office I'm in right now. All of these things are certainly possible. And so looking for the ways that you can either save money or make a bit of money on the sustainability pieces is critical. And it's certainly possible if you know what you're looking for.
That's great. Yeah, I would love a solar paneled carport at my office. Jeff, since the largest majority of these carbon inputs in the printing stream are coming from paper, there's been lots of paper initiatives over the years, FSC, FSI, Should the printing industry be looking to the paper manufacturing industry to lead the printing industry? What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's an enormous role for the paper industry to play in this. So particularly, and it's not just climate, it's also biodiversity, nature, water risk here. So when we look at the paper industry, you have risk for waste, you have risk for it's a water intensive unit, it's energy intensive here. And for those companies that are sourcing virgin fiber, especially those that aren't coming from FSC certified, essentially sustainably managed forest here, there's a huge risk for biodiversity and nature impacts. And, recently, I don't know if you all are aware, but Montreal hosted the negotiations for what's become our global biodiversity framework, where all of our governments came together, including the Canadian, US governments, to commit to, conserve nature and reduce the impacts on biodiversity. And there's a clause in there on companies, governments putting in place legislation for companies to actually report on their nature and their biodiversity risk here. And so that falls to the paper companies. So, first and foremost, as a supplier, you should be looking at suppliers and say, well, what is the risk associated? Are you providing us 100% FSC certified paper? And even better, are you providing post-consumer recycled content that is FSC certified there? So at Sistana, we recognized this risk a long time ago. So our entire business model is built around taking waste paper, sorted office paper, looking even at gable tops now we've invested in taking that waste and recycling it into, fiber that's then used in our printing papers here. And where we do need to have a small amount of virgin fiber for, say, our 30% option, then it's 100% FSC certified. And if you don't have FSC certification, it's going to be a huge risk. You should also, because we're an energy intensive industry here, you should be looking at, so what are our emissions and what's our energy use coming from here? And, paper companies really need to be investing in that. You also want to know, are our own operations, are they located next to key biodiversity areas? There are a lot of key biodiversity areas in Canada. So that's something you'll be wanting to ask, and companies are asked to report on that. So in our sustainability report coming out this year, we show we have 0 operations in close proximity to any key biodiversity areas there. And then you're looking at water usage as well. So look to your companies, engage your major suppliers, ask them for their sustainability reports, their disclosures, try to understand that risk that's there, because that's ultimately your risk. And those are questions that when you're selling to those larger companies, they're going to be asking you, and they want to know what safeguards you've put in place. Another social topic that we should be aware of here is modern slavery. So typically when we think of Canada, companies in North America, we're not thinking of child labor or indentured servitude in the factories. Sadly, data is showing that there's been an increase in that, and the statistics on modern slavery exists everywhere in the world. And there is an increase in legislation, both in Canada. Here, we're looking at what's the name of the law exactly it's the supply chain, it's transparency law that's out there. But the UK, Australia, and also California have UK Modern Slavery Acts, which ask for transparency in the supply chain. Despite us not being subject to these laws, we're seeing a huge increase of requests for our public modern slavery statement, which then requires us to talk about what steps are we taking to identify and measure the risk in our own supply chain and our own operations for modern slavery, and what mitigation measures we've put in place. So this regulation is increasing. It's coming, even though you might not be subject to it directly, your customers are, and they will be asking for you to provide that information as well.
And we see it more and more on RFPs coming out from larger corporations. I guess the question that I sort of ask myself is, is it our responsibility as printers to educate the companies that don't have those on their RFPs and lead the way and show total cost rather than just the upsell cost of using recycled paper? And I think the answer is yes. We have a chat question asking if paperless billing is real, or is that a subsection, or would you consider it greenwashing? Tova.
I mean, it's good. Every little thing helps. I would never say don't do something that's going to reduce the amount of waste that goes out. If you think about the transportation emissions, all that kind of stuff, but there's high emissions from things like data centers as well.
That's right.
It's interesting because I don't know if anybody ever watched The Good Place, but that idea of like you make what you think is the best decision, and there's all this stuff behind it. So it's constantly asking the questions and just trying to work through it. So paperless billing would be a good step. I think there's also all kinds of other things that you can look to. When I was in the marketing agency, I just defaulted everything to 100% recycled paper, unless the client asked me specifically for not that. I just did. Like it wasn't even a question. And
Sure.
the printers that we worked with knew it was my project if it came through on 100% recycled paper. Would be an interesting thing for a printer to say, we are going to default to this unless there's some reason why not. Because now 100% recycled paper is a great option. It used to be when I started doing it 15 years ago, they were like, whew, nobody saw that coming. But now it's, really accessible. It's not unusual. It's a great option. It helps with brand recognition. So things like that, where you can take these little steps, and what you're doing is virtue signaling, which some people will downplay, but it starts to create culture change. And culture change is the far harder part of sustainability. The technical stuff, while it is probably overwhelming to those who don't live and breathe this every day, we have the technical stuff to get to a much, much, much lower, almost carbon neutral society if we chose to do it. It's the culture change. It's the thinking about how do you run your processes differently. It's the thinking about asking your finance people to do additional stuff. It's thinking about this is part of our disclosure. That's far harder. So doing things like we're going to default to recycled paper only is a bit of a shift, a step towards the culture change. And that piece is really important.
Sure. And I guess types of materials that we use definitely comes into play. I mean, when I started in this industry, it was a paper-based industry, and we see paper and plastic now in a lot of projects. So I guess really trying to find alternatives to virgin, alternatives to polymers, and choosing the best materials out there. Holly, you and I were discussing this yesterday for a little bit about choosing alternative methods to wrapping skids, or even the concept of single-use plastics. Could you elaborate on that for our audience today?
Yeah, I think it's really important to start to consider these alternatives and to put the work in as maybe a larger printing company or whichever company you're from to do that testing so that these alternative materials can begin to be produced in larger quantities. So things like bioplastics, perhaps, or even just recycled plastic. If you're doing things like polybagging, trying to find that alternative where the plastic itself has been recycled can make a huge difference. Like you were saying about the skids, we currently wrap skids, or most people currently wrap skids in kind of like a large plastic wrap kind of situation. And it's not that difficult to just switch that to a recycled craft paper that you're wrapping your skid in. And it's these small kind of alternatives and putting in the work to do the testing on these materials and to reach out to the companies that are piloting them to get them to be a bit more large scale and usable for these larger companies.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
We had a great question come up, which I've been trying to dive into, and I'll try not to
Sure.
be too technical in this, but we had a question. Some paper companies are reporting that if GHG is your main concern, then virgin paper can be better in some cases, counter to popular instincts. So again, what we need to look at here is when you just go with a general software to help you calculate emissions, it's using these average emissions factors. So typically across the industry, what's the average GHG emissions per short ton of paper that's come out here, or metric ton of fiber? So it really depends on where it's coming from, and how you'll meet your targets and understand your real emissions is getting that actual data. So at Sistana here, you want to look first at the end of it, get the actual LCAs, and you want to make sure that's life cycle assessment of the product. So what's the environmental, the greenhouse gas emissions, the biodiversity impacts. So if you're going with virgin, even if it is FSC certified, you're running greater risk of biodiversity or nature impacts. They're much lower than non-FSC certified, so definitely go with FSC certified. But then when you look at recycled, post-consumer recycled content paper, that's waste. That was going to go to landfills. We still have an enormous amount going to landfills. So there's methane emissions coming from that. So when you take that paper, yes, there's emissions associated with recycling it, but it depends on how that company is recycling that fiber. So if we look at our Breakyville facility, it's next to Montreal. Our electricity that we use is like 99% produced from renewable energy, hydroelectricity, right? We have very few other emissions in that plant because we're highly efficient. And with our paper making, we've been sourcing biogas instead of natural gas for, I think 2021 was 95% of our boiler's energy comes from that biogas plant, that was a renewable energy. So our emissions from our plant are incredibly low. And so combining the recycled content, which reduces your nature risk here that you have, your biodiversity risk, with really low emissions in your production processes, and then also low water usage. Like we recycle our water, I think last time we checked was close to 30 times, right? So that helps reduce it. So you can't just look at it. The other thing I want you to be careful about is comparing LCAs. So in the plastics industry, they have these, sometimes they have, not all, but sometimes there are really crazy assumptions around them, and even in the fiber. So thinking about the number of times the fiber can be recycled, or are they including methane leakage in those LCAs, which is a huge, source of emissions. Most of the time they're not, right? So you have to compare apples with apples, and you have to then look uniquely at who your individual supplier is and that actual data.
And if I can just add one piece to that, if you think about virgin paper, it's actually doing deforestation, which has, I think Jeffrey sort of like alluded to this, but if you think about land use change, it then has a whole bigger effect. It's like the question about food waste. People talk about food waste.
Sure.
Why does food waste matter so much? It's partly that you're deforesting things, and you've got a land use change, which has a long-term effect on the climate. So it is, sure enough, just saying it's complex. It is complex, but when you dig down into all of the life cycle piece, it can be a lot more obvious what the choice could be.
So it's really our responsibility to zoom out, look at, macro impacts, and then zoom in and, tell your kid to eat the rest of his dinner because he just paid $5 for the hamburger. It is that, honestly, it's you got to look from large to small on all of these issues.
I could jump in too. Sorry. I really like this topic. I think too, like in any of the analysis that I've done, like recycled content paper just kind of blows away virgin fiber paper in every aspect. You can there's a really great resource called the paper calculator, where you can input the type of paper that you're using and whether, how much recycled content it has, and it can literally tell you a pretty good idea of what the greenhouse gas emissions will be for each of those different types of paper. I think there's also something that I've heard a lot in the printing industry that I think is a little bit of a dangerous idea is I hear a lot of people say, oh, save a tree, kill a fish, when they're talking about recycled paper, because there's this idea that recycling paper uses so much water. And so it's like, well, maybe we won't use recycled paper because we care so much about the water. And I think, it's not really a fair comparison. And like Jeff was saying, for the most part, recycled paper facilities are reusing that water so much that it's just like a fallacy that's out there right now. I think that recycling the paper is this huge amount of water waste that somehow makes it more impactful than the virgin fiber.
Yeah, and there's a great way to measure that. So the standards we talked about, the Global Reporting Initiative, and also SASB, Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, for paper companies, they have metrics that you can use. So and we're reporting on those. So how much water are we withdrawing, surface water here, from what aquifers, and then how much of that water are we returning to the same or another aquifer there? You can see our water intensity rates here. So those are great indicators to look at from your suppliers. Ask them for those indicators, ask them to report, and you might be asked to report around those indicators as well.
We do a year-end report. We still print it. We print 250 copies. And at the back of that year-end report, we have an environmental impact statement that says how much water was saved from this, how much greenhouse gas was saved from the 100% recycled content. All of the logos are there. It aligns with the value of the work that we do, and people would expect nothing less. But, again, we talked about why is recycled not your standard? Why is that not the standard as well? Why is this not something that the printers could say, you know, we, as part of our environmental commitment, ask you to put this kind of thing on here, which encourages the choice for recycled content paper. Like, these things are all here. That paper calculator is exactly where we got these numbers. It's a really cool thing to do and make it more public.
We should really be using that paper calculator. We only have a minute left or so, but I feel like, you know, as the printing industry and in general, the larger community of graphic arts, we really need to educate ourselves and move forward on implementing some of, well, many of these things that we've talked about today. There's costs associated with these, and people are going to get hung up on costs on implementing these. And what is the ROI? What is the ROI typically for a company that goes down the road of sustainability? And what's the return for sustainability? And what's the opposite? What if you don't do anything? What happens then? 1 minute.
I was on mute. Great question. So I'll answer the end of that, actually, because I think my colleagues can really drive the other part of the question. But it's now not just, you can't not do anything. It's about a license to operate. What's your social contract? What's your social license to operate? If you are not taking sustainability seriously, you're not going to be considered within the RFPs that are coming out here. It's going to be a regulatory requirement, not just for publicly listed companies, but for private companies. All this legislation you're seeing coming out in the EU as well. If you're, you know, you may not be exporting to the EU, but your companies that you sell to may be exporting to the EU here. Canada's having new regulations. So you really need to put in systems now, at least from a commitment, a governance perspective, and a data collection perspective there. And then I think my colleagues can talk to, you know, about the savings they've experienced internally with, you know, the return on investment from, you know, energy or energy efficiency or water savings.
Go for it, Holly.
Yeah. Maybe this isn't exactly a specific saving, but something that I like to say is that the ROI for investing in sustainability is that your business can be operationally sustainable for the future. Because this is a world that we're now living in where our activities are directly impacting our future and the future of our business activities. And so if we're putting in the work upfront to make our business more sustainable, whether that's investing in recycled material because, you know, we don't want to be worried about a future of resource shortages. There's lots of ways in which our investments are making our business future-proof to climate risk in the future.
Brilliant. And Tova, last word?
Sure. Actually, I would like to turn it around a little bit because I've talked a bit about ROI and efficiency, saving you money and all of those those benefits that come to a company. But I would turn this around and say that the design and printing world actually has the potential to be a leader to change how the whole world sees things, because everything that ends up in our hands came through you. So if you actually started making those changes, started creating a culture change in your value supply chain, you would be actually shifting every customer that gets that piece in the end. So think about the leadership potential that this industry could come to. It could become one of the major drivers towards, and remember, sustainability isn't about the bugs and the birds and the trees and the bunnies. It's about the survival of humanity. That's what climate change fight is. So if you actually see this as an opportunity to elevate the industry as a leader, and the Canadian industry specifically as a leader that is saying, we're going to make this world a better place, and we're going to show every single organization and every organization we work with, and every person that gets our products in the end, that sustainability matters and we can all do it. There's power in that. And if you want to talk marketing, man, like, think of the marketing impact of that. That's how I would want to leave it, is let's inspire instead of backpedal.
Well, that's a very, very strong message to leave with, and inspiring, definitely. I encourage everyone watching this webinar to go back, make a team, and start down the road of being more sustainable within your organization. Thank you for the panelists for speaking today, and it's been a great discussion, my goodness. In closing, we'd like to thank our sponsors. Our platinum sponsors include Asia Pulp and Paper, Canon, Durst, HP, Konica Minolta, Spicers, TriNet Global Logistics. Our gold sponsors, Adobe, Fujifilm, Graphics Canada, Heidelberg, Innovative Display, Kodak, Kongsberg Precision Cutting Systems, Mini Giants, Plastic and Paper. Our silver sponsor, Sydney Stone. We'd like to thank HP for providing technical support and assistance. And our next education meeting will be Friday, May 12th at 8 a.m., a breakfast meeting, get ready for it, at Graphics Canada. It's in person only with limited attendance. So you can book with Marg at the Digital Imaging Association.com, and with your registration comes a free show admission. So you might want to do that fast. New this year at Graphics Canada, the DIA Members Lounge is being introduced, and we invite you to come. It's in room 508 on Thursday, May 11th from 10 a.m. till 5 p.m., Friday, May 12th at 10 a.m. till 4 p.m., and drop by. Also, as a reminder, the DIA Golf Tournament is happening Tuesday, June 13, from noon until 8 p.m. at the Nottawasaga Golf Course. To reserve your seats, please contact Marg McLeod at marg at digitalimagingassociation.com. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you found this educational and fun. There was a lot to think about today. In appreciation of our panel's generous contribution of time and knowledge for today's presentation, a donation is being made on your behalf to the Canadian Print Scholarship Fund. Thank you for joining us today, guys. That was amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.